All right, we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about modernizing, or maybe just modern, full-stack application development on InterSystems Iris. My name is Tim Leavitt. I'm the development manager in application services at InterSystems. I manage a team of 9 developers working on 12 applications, all built on Iris, ranging in age from 1 year to 22 years plus. So there's a wide variety there, and we've faced a wide variety of, I think, the same problems that you all are building on Iris and looking to move older user interfaces to new technology that looks good, is more responsive, and is more secure. So we'll talk a little bit today about the history of InterSystems web technology, my team's journey as we look to move into the future. We'll look at 3 new open source tools that just released on the Open Exchange this morning, and we'll look at an example application that puts all of those together. So hopefully coming out of this, you'll have a better sense of how to move forward with modern web UI along with Iris, and you'll learn about some of these new tools we've released that make it easier to do so. So the key takeaway that I'd like to come out from this with is understanding that rapid, secure, and sustainable web application development is still a reality, and now easier than ever with these new open source tools with InterSystems Iris and modern industry standard web technology. So a little bit of history. Some of you are probably familiar with this, some of you may not be. I've been at InterSystems 13 years now, including my time as an intern, so when Zen was brand new when I showed up. CSP is still foundational for well, building REST APIs if nothing else, and we're still using this in our own products in the management portal and interoperability. We also had this false start with Zen Mojo that you might remember just really didn't pan out. So just quick show of hands, who is responsible for building things in CSP right now? Like tag-based or class-based CSP? Zen? Oh, okay. Nobody's using Zen Mojo. You don't count, you're at InterSystems. So some pros and cons with these older UI technologies. One pro is that it's close to the database. It's easy to, you have just straightforward access to the database to work with data as you're building out the UI. This is also a bit of a con. There's also a very simple architecture and stack. It's all in Cache or now Iris, and you don't need to worry about, it just all plays nicely together. A major con of this is because just the way that CSP and Zen is structured, you end up with a very poorly defined API for how the client interacts with the server. And that means that you have a very wide attack surface for what, from a security perspective, what someone might try to exploit. The other con, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, is if you want to use CSP, you need to learn CSP, and there just aren't a lot of people out there, other than in this room, who know CSP. So really what modern full stack on Iris looks like is using %csp.rest to build out REST APIs, and then your UI technology of choice. So we got some pros and cons here too. Pro is you have a well-defined API with %csp.rest. That is, those are the only ways that the application can/should interact with the server, and it's spelled out there to some extent. Another pro is that you can find someone on the street who knows React or Angular or fill in the blank, and they can talk to your REST API, and it's easier to staff for UI development. So a few cons here. How do you define your API? Is it spec first, or you already have this maybe very large application built on Iris? So how do you build out an API? Do you do it all at once? Do you bite off little pieces at a time? And there's also, as you do this, you're going to be like, this is too slow. I want to do something faster so that I don't need to keep hand coding the same thing over and over again. And it's really hard to find the balance there between excessive hand coding of individual endpoints and writing a generic implementation that is difficult to secure because you're just saying, you know, give me any ID of any class, say. You need some better security. And better design than that. And you don't want to expose too much about the underlying database. So let's look a little bit at the OWASP API top 10. So OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project. They have a ton of really useful resources in the security world. If you're interested in the top 10 as relates to Iris, I have another presentation on Thursday that you should come to. But we'll look at common API flaws, which are true to APIs in general, including web services, but really in this case, we're talking about REST. So number one is broken object level authorization. So this is an individual, an endpoint that operates on a specific object, say maybe by ID. You need to make sure that the user actually has access to that ID to create or update or delete it. Number two is broken user authentication. Especially if you're looking to roll your own authentication mechanism, it's easy to end up doing something wrong and leaving a hole there. And I should add that these rankings are based on a combination of what's actually seen in the wild and security expert feedback. Number three is excessive data exposure, which is to say, suppose you need a small piece of information in the UI, and in your API, you're just sending back everything about some particular record. So I heard an interesting example in a podcast recently where there was I think Verizon payment portal where it showed the last 4 digits of the account number. But in the API, it was returning the full account number. And an attacker was able to use that to say, hi, I'm calling about account so-and-so, and I want to change or activate this new phone, and thereby doing a SIM swap, because an API was exposing too much data. Number 4 is lack of resources and rate limiting. So a single innocent or maliciously misbehaving client could take down the entire server by issuing too many requests or consuming too many resources. Or maybe the server is just poorly resourced itself. And you'll see that one's not in bold, and we'll get to that in a minute. Number 5 is broken function level authorization. So you're not just doing, creates, reads, updates, deletes. There's also business logic that you may fire from your REST APIs, and you need to make sure the user is authorized for that as well. Number 6, mass assignment is kind of the flip side of excessive data exposure. Maybe you're only exposing a couple fields, but if a user sends a payload in the way that the UI doesn't, that has all the fields, you could allow updating more fields than should be. Number 7 is security misconfiguration. I think the number one thing here is CORS. So if you extend %csp.rest and just say handle CORS request equals 1, that's not good. And our documentation is very clear about that, but it's an easy thing to just end up doing. So that would really, having CORS wide open like that makes any site's cross-site scripting vulnerability your problem, and that's not good. Number 8 is just classic injection. This might be SQL injection, maybe in some generic implementation that's saying, filter by this field is equal to this value, and maybe in either the field or the value, you're just directly concatenating user input into an SQL statement. And the user input might be, and 1 equals 0, union all, select whatever data I want from whatever table I want, and there's the possibility for data exposure there. Number 9 is improper assets management. So this is really answering the question, what are my APIs anyway, and how do they work? And one of the main ways to do this is through open API specifications, to say this is exactly what the shape of my API and the objects that it returns and interacts with are. And then number 10 is insufficient logging and monitoring. So if you're under attack, how do you know? And if something's going wrong, do you know about it? So that really within these, I would say, going back, number 4 and number 10 are more a topic for API management and our abilities around that, which are inconveniently being discussed in another session running right now. But the rest of these are things that a good generic REST framework implementation can handle. And in app services journey, moving from legacy to more modern UI, that's what we've ended up building and what we're excited to share with you through the Open Exchange. So a little bit about our journey. We want to replace our old CSP and Zen user interfaces. We have all our existing data and schemas that we want to keep that are the heart of our application. We don't want to redesign that part too. We do, unfortunately, always end up with some business logic that's sitting in those CSP and Zen pages that we need to refactor out of there because we want to keep that too. And I mentioned we have, my team is 9 developers working on a dozen applications, so there's a ton of variety and people need to be able to jump around to different places. So we really want all of these applications to look and work the same way, from how our APIs look and how they work, and our UI structure and our build and deployment processes. And on that note of build and deployment, we're still, if we're working with CSP and Zen, deployment is just load a class. Deployment of an Angular UI is a little more complicated than that in terms of building it, in terms of maybe sending it out to a web server. So we've built some things to help with that as well. We also want to have a catalog of all our APIs for internal use and for reference of developers. So we want to have that open API documentation, and ideally we wouldn't need to write it all by hand ourselves. So we built tools to work with all of these things, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about now. The way that it's a slightly different perspective on things in terms of how we're doing things, but it's all the same tools and code. So how many of you are familiar with the package manager? Because this is all going to be in that context, where these are third-party tools. You need some way to declare your dependency on, I want to use this and this and this. And the package manager provides a way to do that. There was just an experience lab on that I think I recognize a few of you from. And there's another one of those as well that probably still has some spots open if you're curious to learn more. So what we have is 3 packages that are available through GitHub, and if you want, you can just git clone and figure out how to load the classes and stuff yourself, or it's just with the package manager as easy as, oh, that's a typo, should be install isc.rest, not pkg. So it's just zpm to get into the package manager shell, and then install isc.rest. So we'll talk about these 3 packages. isc.json is basically %json from Iris, except moving faster. It's a fork of the %json package from Iris that is blessed by InterSystems product management. I didn't just go do this and they're going to find out about it tomorrow. It's an IOU for eventual support in Iris, but what it allows us to do is evolve in the open with semantic versioning to say, maybe we made a mistake. In Iris, the expectation is once it's there, you can always use it. It's always going to be safe. We're not going to break compatibility on you. With this, we might, but we just release a new major version, and you keep using your old major version, and you're still good. And that's really the way the industry works as a whole. So it's good for us to work that way on the Open Exchange as well. So instead of extending %json.adapter, you would extend %pkg.isc.json.adapter. And I'll note that when you install these packages that have those % classes, it sets up mappings to your current namespace default routine database. So we're not like throwing things in IrisLib, because that would be bad. And it's probably read-only and should be read-only. And the % is really just to say, this is InterSystems code. We're actually using this and the next package we're going to talk about in Health Share and Iris for Health as well. So that doesn't mean you can't use it, but it does mean because it's InterSystems code, we're putting that % sign there rather than infringing on your space of names you can use. And there's extensive documentation on this. Well, there's a reasonable level of documentation on this in GitHub. For each of these, there is a user guide. In this case, we really just point to the %json .json package documentation and say these are the things that are different or the additional features. isc.rest is a security-first, sustainable, and rapid REST API development framework. We released an earlier version of this, which is really exactly what we're using in app services a couple years ago at this point as apps-rest. So we really proved this initially in app services, and HealthShare has adopted it, as I mentioned. for building out some of their new REST APIs. So it's security first in that there are built-in solutions for a lot of the OWASP API top 10 that we just talked about in terms of you have very tight control of what are your inputs and outputs, and you need to specifically choose to enable whatever actions you want to perform on some particular resource that you're exposing over REST. It's rapid in that it's easy to build APIs to existing schemas or even new APIs alongside new schemas as you develop them. It's also really easy to expose your existing business logic, either exposing class queries to access over REST or just methods and even instance methods. It's easy to build the glue to handle the serialization and deserialization and to and from JSON and your REST APIs. And it's sustainable in that all of your resources in your application look and work the same. There's not a lot of hand coding that you need to do to solve the same problem over and over again. And on top of that, we can also generate an open API specification from the server's knowledge of what the structure of these APIs is. And that means that you can review that or put it into some other third-party tool that gives you a pretty UI around it to say, okay, this is what my API is doing. Oh, that field shouldn't be there. I need to go fix that, for example. So some key concepts here. There's a generic %csp. Well, just backing up. Is anyone currently using, or who is currently using REST with %csp.rest for web application development? So you extend %csp.rest, you override a URL map x data block, and you add all of the paths that call different class methods and what the HTTP method is, what CORS handling is, and then generally you would what I tend to see happen is there's just like 50 class methods in the class, one for each of the endpoints, and that class gets huge. Like, I think our base Atelier REST API is like 4,000 lines of object script. Or VS Code. The API's VS Code uses another history thing. So instead of overriding that URL map, there is a standardized URL map that takes into account the names of individual resources. So you have a class that defines a given representation of a REST resource and all of the security constraints on that representation. And then out of the box, provided that you say, yes, these things are allowed, you have your CRUD operations and also a uniform interface for querying these, the underlying tables. There's also a concept of actions that we'll see in a minute that wrap other data retrieval and business logic. So an action might wrap a class query, might wrap a call to a class method or an instance method on a particular instance of a resource. And then there's open API generation for all of this. So let's just look at a sample, an example here. You can see it in the isc-rest GitHub repo under samples/phonebook. So I have two persistent classes. I have person. Is that large enough for you to see? Even in the back? Okay, got thumbs up from the back. Thank you. So we have a persistent class, also extended %populate, of course, to put some sample data in there. It's JSON enabled by extending %pkg.isc.json.adapter. And it extends this other class, %pkg.isc.rest.model.adapter. And that says that this is a REST resource. The name of that resource is contact. So in our standard URL map structure, it's going to be the API root/contact, and that's where this data is exposed. We've overridden the name property to say it shows up as lowercase name in JSON, and we have a phone numbers relationship that is output only in JSON. So if you try to update it, it won't take it. And the field name is phones. And we're not just including the IDs, we're including the entire object here. So in every REST resource, there is a check permission method that, given an ID, the operation you're performing on that ID, or just in general, and some representation of the current user, which we'll talk about in a little more detail in a minute, says, are you allowed to do this or not? So what we're saying here is, you're allowed to query, anyone is allowed to query, read, create, or update, or perform either of these two actions. We don't allow direct delete of a person. So if I try that, it'll say, no, you can't do that. And then further down, there is this action map. And actually, I'm going to pause and just demonstrate the things we've talked about so far. So I have a web application. Actually, stepping back one thing first. Instead of having a subclass of %csp.rest, there's a subclass of %pkg.isc.rest.handler. And there are 3 methods that are overridden there. Authentication strategy. In this case, this is just a fancy way of saying we're using iris password authentication. Get user resource. This is just a class that wraps $username. So that's what we have as our concept of a user. It's just their iris username. In theory, you might have, in addition to the iris user table, some of your own application-specific user concepts that you would want to include in that, just for easy reference in different REST endpoints. And then there's also this check resource permitted method, which in this case just makes sure it's a class from the same package of classes in ObjectScript. And this is to allow multiple things in the same namespace to use this, so that if you have independent applications living next to each other, they're not polluting each other with their own resources. So this REST dispatch class is configured as the dispatch class for a web application. In my case, /csp/user/phonebook-sample/API. There's a lot of parts. But then within that, there's a contact resource. And if I issue a get on the top level, I can see that I changed my password, so I'm getting a 401 unauthorized, as I would expect. If I fix that, there we go. So I can see I have ID and name. If someone has phone numbers, those are listed in an array. Those also include the ID, the number, and the type. I could also get an individual contact. And that just returns a single record by ID. If I try to delete that, oops. I get some error or another depending on what exactly the headers are. 403 forbidden, or possibly something related to just, it doesn't have the shape of a request that's expected. It can also say question mark name. There's a syntax here to say filter by name is equal to a particular value or contains, and that's all documented. And this is based on the field name in the JSON representation, and only the fields that are in the JSON representation are permitted for querying. So back to the person class, I can see that there are also some actions here. So this says the add phone action targets an instance of this class. You issue an HTTP post, and it'll call the add phone number method in this class. That's an instance method in this class. And that method has an argument that is of a JSON-enabled type. It returns a JSON-enabled type, and we automatically handle the serialization and deserialization there. And then there's another method that calls a class query that selects an ID from an ID of an object in this class, and then will automatically constitute objects based on that ID. So we'll just look at those quick examples. I'll add, for contact ID 2, for ID 1, I'll add a phone number that is 1-800-Flowers, and we'll make that the office phone number. And I shouldn't have changed my password right before this. I was like, it's going to look bad if I have a 3-character password, so I'm going to change it to something longer, and didn't go back and update all my API calls figures. So we can see in the response there, it returns the person with all of that person's phone numbers. Can also search. So this, we can see we're looking for where phone fragment equals flowers with this action find by phone. And it matches that one record. So under the hood, that's calling the find by phone class query and returns a bunch of IDs for objects of the current class. You could say just return the query results raw as well. But we're turning that into a bunch of objects of this type. So on top of that, we also, that solves the REST API problem. And this has worked out very well for my team as we've worked to build out REST APIs to a number of older applications. The next problem is how do we build and deploy our Angular UI in our case? So within InterSystems, we've really heavily adopted and decided on Angular. So really what we want to be able to do is build and package our Angular UI kind of similarly to how we do our object script sources, just to keep things simple. So what this package, isc-ipm-js, does is integrates JavaScript and TypeScript build processes into the InterSystems Package Manager, which means that when you say install some package, that'll also, under the hood, if you're in a development mode, run an npm CI and build whatever UI you're working with. ng-build for Angular, I'm sure there's an equivalent for other things. And then when you publish that application out to a registry, it won't work for the Open Exchange because the way it ties in is a little different, but it'll just publish the built Angular sources so that when you go to deploy it somewhere else, you don't need to rerun that build. And that is all packaged up and installable along with your Iris code in ObjectScript or Python or whatever. We also support code generation from isc.rest's auto-generated OpenAPI specifications through another third-party tool that's just OpenAPI-generator, and it supports all sorts of different client languages, not just TypeScript and Angular. So we're able to build that into the package manager such that it's just a single really short command you need to run in terminal to regenerate all of your client code for interacting with the REST API. So we'll, there's one other aspect to this as well that's very specific to Angular, which is there is within a single page application, there's what's called the path location strategy, where you're seeing index.html, but within that, I'm explaining this poorly. So the URL is pretty, ultimately, is the goal. And even though the HTML page that you're seeing is the index.html for the web application, the URL would be something like /myapp/home or /record/ID of the record. And it's just a prettier UI. So normally the way you would do that is through some sort of web server configuration. But another thing we have within this package is, for Angular at least, being able to support that through a %csp.rest subclass that you configure for a web application along with a CSP file's physical path, and it'll handle all that at the CSP layer instead of doing web server customization. So that just really simplifies deployment. We'll put this all together and look at a sample application that is also available on the Open Exchange. A bit of a caveat here, while I was working on this today, I found 2 separate bugs in the package manager. So installing this and running it will be very easy very soon, but it's not quite yet. So what this sample app is, it's just a simple REST API and a really simple Angular UI wrapping the line-by-line monitor, which you can use to troubleshoot performance issues in Iris. It uses Angular and Bootstrap and demonstrates all 3 of these packages that we've talked about. So I'll show you what it looks like first. I have /csp/test/monlbl-viewer, pretty URL, relatively speaking. I can say I'm going to start the line-by-line monitor. I'm going to monitor %pkg.isc.star. There's some default metrics selected, and I'll start it. Now I see a list of all the routines. I can pull one of them up. So here's our, oh, that's not actually going to have anything interesting. Here's our base REST handler class, and I can see the routine code and all the metrics. Can sort by any of these columns. And normally if I'm using this, I'm interested in, okay, there's that top thing. I'm spending like all my time on this line. Where is it in context? And I can click on that and see it in context within the rest of the int code. So it's kind of a toy example. I'm going to end up actually using this for my normal work as well. But what it looks like is using, nope, not that one. When you're using the InterSystems Package Manager, there's a file called module.xml at the top level that has all of the information about the package that you're working on. So in this case, it has the name, it has the version, description. I've declared dependencies on isc.rest and transitively isc.json, as well as isc-ipm-js. I've said that the package of classes starting with pkg.isc.perf.ui is part of this. And then I've defined some, I've said that the folder within this, ng/monlbl-viewer, should be handled in a specific way. That is to say, when I install this, do the Angular build, or reconstitute from the build artifact. And then the Angular build puts files in dist/monlbl-viewer. So we say copy all that over to a web application. There's a REST API that has a subclass of our base isc-rest REST handler. And there's support, or there's a pointer to generate OpenAPI out to /API/OpenAPI.json, and there are some instructions there for what to do to generate Angular sources. So ultimately, it's just a couple classes, just describing data. The main one is the wraps all of the different things you would do with the line-by-line monitor in actions in the isc-rest framework. So check its status, start it, stop it, pause, resume, list all the metrics, get all the results. And all of these just have JSON-enabled parameters and return types, and isc-rest handles the serialization and deserialization again. And then I can just run cpm isc.perf.ui generate to say, regenerate all of my Angular services and models that have the shape of the data and what the REST API expects and returns, and that'll update my Angular client code. And that's using the InterSystems Package Manager. So the output of that, process is under app generated, I have models, I have services for the different shapes of data that the REST API expects and returns. So that might have been a little bit too much of a technical deep dive. If you have questions about it, I want to leave a little bit of time for that. Looking toward the future here, I'm glad to see so many people interested in this in here. Hopefully you're still interested. So I'm really looking forward to your feedback through the developer community. Some of the things that I'd like to see happen next. Right now you need to JSON enable your persistent classes to expose them, and I'd rather not need to do that. So I'm hoping to introduce a JSON and REST model concept where it's parallel to or an abstraction over your persistent classes, just to make it easier to build REST APIs less invasively. I would love to support more project types and build tools. I don't have cause right now to do that beyond Angular, but if you have specific needs, I welcome contributions on that and happy to talk through it, or maybe contribute a bit. And what I would love to see, and this is kind of a pipe dream, but like 3 years ago, the open API stuff was a crazy idea that didn't think it would even be possible, and then an intern came and did it. So maybe sometime we'll have an intern come and build a WebSocket subprotocol or real-time layer to just have, to keep data in sync between client and server. And I don't know if you've used Google Firebase, but I would love to see something like that in Iris. Any questions?
We were talking about modern development and all that, and with the industry largely having moved away from REST, are there any plans for the support of GraphQL?
I believe there is an open exchange package for
It was updated last
GraphQL.
5 years ago and doesn't work. It only supports rudimentary basic queries.
So I also, you say the industry's moved away from REST. I don't share that perspective,
The
but
industry outside of healthcare.
I knew you were going to cause trouble.
Okay, so really, are there any plans for GraphQL?
No, not my plans for GraphQL. Sorry. Any kinder questions? Yes.
Yeah, in the Z application, you have the stripped out model layer, then data model adapter instead of persistent classes. Do you plan on providing a record for that approach?
So that way of doing things in Zen is, in my opinion, a great way of doing things in Zen, and is also partially the inspiration for this approach. So you still need to be proactive about your security, saying, what are you allowed to do with this model? And we force you to do that. But if you're extending %zen.datamodel.adapter, you'd extend the REST adapter and override the necessary things, and that's roughly equivalent. There's also, so there are different levels of how tightly coupled do you want your REST model with your persistence. You might say, you might have the same thing that you want to represent 2 different ways. Say, the same persistent class that you want to build 2 models to, or more than that. And there's support for that in the framework as well. Happy to talk to you about that later if you have questions. Yes?
Any more support for the version library?
I think I would like to just have a simple npm install in just that wrapper. What exactly are you more specifically?
So, for example, an environment that the support is at level client-side interface from that JSON to the database. Is that at level?
Oh, okay. The question was any more support for Node.js, and I misinterpreted it originally. That's also very much not my department and kind of separate from this. I would like to, I would say go over to the Tech Exchange and talk to someone, and they'll help you get connected with the right person. Or just around support for Node.js. Oh, Raj, talk to Raj.
If it's 4:30 and the tech exchange or the half the product manager, maybe we can talk about that.
Because, I mean, ultimately, to really integrate with the Angular or some of the others, I mean, if you really want to use Node as a middle layer, certainly that deserves some sort of thing. But now you got to go right through to Angular, right?
Well,
So putting your support, your security, etc. into the rest.
so in this case, there is no middle layer with Node.
Because you believe the security, but with the rest,
Right.
gone.
Right.
But there could be, other use cases for using Node, like more, let's call it, using something like Nest or something you could use interaction with LDAP or many other, authentication protocols. As a layer outside of the cache layer, the iris layer, and the Angular layer.
All right, that's fair. So just stepping back a little bit, thinking about integrating with things that Iris doesn't integrate with out of the box, I think that embedded Python is really exciting for that. For keeping the simple architecture that is kind of Iris-centric, but being able to just integrate with and do more things out of the box. That's Raj. Other questions? Yeah.
So, Express.js has like Swagger requires documentation. I didn't know if there's a tool that already exists or if you guys plan on making it where it will like analyze routes and do auto documentation for those API.
So that's Swagger and OpenAPI are like the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Well, I didn't know if like.
Oh, like.
Because like there's a thing out there that's an auto Swagger generator. So basically, it'll look at your routes and then it'll actually make a Swagger JSON file for you. So it's auto documented.
Right. So this will look at your REST models that you define in object script classes and produce that file for you. Yes.
How do you use the source control with this? Do you use it on the VM or can you use it locally?
I mean, you can. I think it's an entirely separate decision. I think generally with the package manager, there's an assumption around a client-centric source control model, but my team does all this with more of a server-centric source control model. So it's an independent decision.
There's a multiple user, the same.
I think it's ultimately a completely independent decision from using these frameworks or not. So if I guess I'm not clear how what we've talked about would. Oh, actually, so you mean like for building an Angular UI?
That's source control, like using Git to track the changes.
Yeah. There's another session that'll go into using Git more specifically on Thursday. So that might be worth attending if you have questions about that. I'm also presenting in that one. Yes.
Okay, and maybe this is just something I misheard, but when my manager talked to InterSystems about upgrading, he said that Visual Studio was, had the ability to connect, and therefore we could use our source control with Visual Studio.
That's true.
Okay, because you're using Visual Studio Code, and so I was like,
oh, by Visual Studio, that is Visual Studio Code.
oh, not Visual Studio 2020.
Correct. Yep.
Oh, okay, I'm bleeding already.
That's also a Raj topic, but I'm happy to.
We usually call Visual Studio Code VS Code, just to make it clear. And then Microsoft also has Visual Studio, which is Windows only, more .NET environment. Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah, we're.
Yeah, we don't support that.
Well, as a government institution, we're unfortunately married to Microsoft.
Well,
And,
Visual Studio Code is
so yeah.
I'll talk to you. Let's talk later.
Okay. Yeah, keep me compliant.
Yeah.
With your example, you had the relational structure. And so think of complex data structure where you have a class that relates to a class, relates to a class. Do you have to, does each one of those classes have to extend the tool?
So to be JSON enabled, they need to. To be REST enabled, you just need it at the top level.
At the top level, and then you have to JSON enable all of them down the chain.
Yeah.
You can request that data and you will get all those objects.
It depends. If you want to, yes. If you just want the ID, you can say, I just want the ID. If you want to chain object references, you can do that. Practically speaking, we've tended to define multiple different representations, some that are used when you're embedded in another object that's maybe just like the ID and a name, so we don't need to make a whole separate request for that. The concept of having multiple representations of the same resource is handy there to say if there's like just a simple relationship like that where I don't want to make a separate request to the server just to get the name, it's handy to put both things in the response.
Something we're struggling with our API calls, and at least two of them looked at a GraphQL type middleware solution, but it's we have complex data structures. We're trying to create generic APIs, and you're making requests just to marry the data up on the client side. So enabling your related classes so they can come back as an object in one call is intriguing.
Yeah. Yes.
So I think I know the answer to the question, but do any of these tools support decoupling your server-side methods defined on CSP into a true?
Yeah. So if it depends on if your server-side methods are really just doing, create, read, update, delete, then they're no longer relevant. If they're firing off some kind of business logic, what you'd probably do is turn those into an action in the REST resource. Yes.
There's also a mention of using Python and other languages. Even F#. Is that possible, or is that just
Python? Yes. F#? No.
okay, all Python's start? So
yeah.
Is there a way to migrate like MOPS code to Python, or are we just
no? Hire developers who know mumps.
Are you gonna start your own MOPS at university to keep them going?
All right, I'm gonna let the next people set up, but I'm happy to continue with questions in the back if you have any.